I am trained as an archaeologist. I was at St John's College, Cambridge at the end of the 1950s, so I had a very orthodox training, specialising in the later prehistory of Europe. It wasn't really till I came to Glasgow University to be an assistant curator at the Hunterian Museum in 1960 that I really heard about Alexander Thom and his work. And that was introduced to me about 3 years later by Professor Archie Roy, who died recently, unfortunately, who had been surveying some stone circles on Arran and wanted me to assist with their publication to make sure he hadn't made any archaeological blunders and so on. And he told me about Professor Thom and his work. But it really wasn't until Thom's first book appeared in 1967 and the row that provoked in the archaeological profession that I became seriously interested in all this and eventually decided I ought to try and do something to persuade myself either that it was all nonsense or that there was something in it. The reason our Neolithic ancestors built stone circles and standing stones and henge monuments is of course much argued over by not only by archaeologists but by other interested people as well. My own view, taking into account what I now think about Thom's work, is that they were the edifices, the instruments, if you like, and the ceremonial centres of a priesthood, a Neolithic professional priesthood, who existed in the 3rd millennium and part of the 2nd millennium BC. This is not a popular view in archaeology, but I think most people would accept that they were ritual sites of some kind, and that so important that a gigantic effort was made by many communities to heave the stones up and into position and bring them to the site and so on. So whatever view you take about the exact function, the work involved seems to have been absolutely central to the societies of the time. The reason they arouse such strong feelings is not entirely clear to me. I think, judging from my own experience, when you see a standing stone on a bit of Scottish moorland, it does somehow seem to be speaking to you, or at least challenging you to explain it. Why did this monster block get dragged there and heaved up, rammed into its socket? Was it just random? Was it a signpost for a footpath or bridle path, or was there something more to it? They are very dramatic structures, the circles and the stones, and of course the slightly earlier chambered tombs and so on. Also perhaps the fact that there's not much else from that time which you can look at, except in Orkney, makes them seem that more important and requiring our understanding. I would go for the atmosphere, the lonely places, the dramatic stones. I think that really can't fail to have an effect on you. I'm not at all sure what the long-term motivation of these people was. If we take it as a reasonable idea, for example, that the standing stones usually marked some kind of calendar line or astronomical alignment, I would imagine that the only alternative they had to ramming in a wooden post was an upright stone. Whether they thought, well, this will be here for another 5,000 years, I think that's rather unlikely. But they knew that posts only had a life of 20 years or more, so they thought, at least if they thought in terms of a few generations of their colleagues, they would want to have something massive there. And they seem to have had the power and authority to recruit the labour to do it, which itself is very interesting. The reason for moving stones to their chosen sites, it's hard for us to grasp now unless we adopt one of the explanatory theories, like the astronomical motivation or something like that. I suspect that the stones were moved not because they could be moved, but because rather there was an organisation that was there and had the power to recruit the labour and so on, and that would imply that there's something more than perhaps a simple village Stone Age society in existence at the time. In fact, I think it was Richard Atkinson who, way back in the 1950s, first made this point, that the sheer amount of labour which was put into Avebury, Stonehenge, Silbury Hill and so on, must mean that there was a powerful man or people, a powerful group, who could recruit the labour from hundreds of miles around to get the work done. As to how it was done, I think enough experimental archaeology has taken place to show that most of what we see could have been done with fairly primitive techniques, rollers of wood, earthen ramps, huge levers, provided there were enough men to work them, and provided, and this is a very important proviso, that there were skilled people to supervise the project. I don't think there's any problem about that in a Stone Age society when you look at what other kinds of Stone Age society there are throughout the world and what they achieved without metal tools. The kind of societies that produced these monuments all over Britain and Ireland and the west coast of Atlantic Europe are so similar, at least the results of their efforts are so similar, that it's difficult to doubt that there was some kind of group or elite class which was doing it. I know a lot of archaeologists don't agree with that and prefer to think of them as the products of a simple agricultural society, but I think that it's only about 50 years since this was generally accepted in the 50s and 60s that there was a group of people from Spain and Portugal right up to Orkney and parts of Scandinavia as well who did this kind of thing. So I think it's quite likely that the idea will come round again because the evidence is so strong. Why otherwise should there be stone circles of basically similar kind throughout the whole of the British Isles, unless there was some kind of organisation which produced them and needed them? Yes, Alexander Thom's work covered several different aspects, one of which was the geometry of the stone circles, another was whether the circle builders laid out the circles using a unit of length, and the third one, of course, was the astronomy, the construction of long, accurate alignments to pinpoint the passage of the sun and moon at important parts of their cycles. As far as the metrology goes, I certainly thought, when I first read megalithic sites in Britain, that he had made out a very good case for there being a standard unit of length. He called it the megalithic yard, just under 33 inches. To lay out the exact circles, which I think no one can doubt, were what most of the stone circles were set out as. A lot of people have spent a lot of time and effort in trying to disprove this. Not being a mathematician, I'm not altogether sure whether I could argue plausibly against that. All I can say is that the parallel work which I have tried to do on an Iron Age building in Scotland known as Brochs has produced, through the same kind of exact surveys of their interior wall faces, has produced evidence, first of all, they are exactly circular, and secondly, that a minority are elliptical in shape, and there seems to be some evidence for the use of a unit of length by the Broch builders. So this is a parallel investigation, if you like, which I don't think would have produced such clear evidence of the kind of work that Thom believed in, unless it was true. Again, this is something that my colleagues in Iron Age studies find rather difficult to accept, and it's not fully published yet, but there's a lot of practical evidence collected in the field, and I think it's going to be quite hard to doubt it once it's all laid out. So yes, I think that there was something more than just random pacing involved in laying out these ancient sites. I think the people concerned had a system, they had a basic knowledge of geometry, and they had some kind of unit of length, but I'm not sure whether the megalithic yard is the right one. Yes, British archaeology has had great difficulty in coming to terms with Tom's ideas. There was a point in the late 60s and the early 1970s when I thought that there might be a sea change occurring in our attitude to the kind of information he was offering us. For example, Colin Renfrew in his book Before Civilization put forward an entirely new radical scenario about European prehistory, which maintained that it did not owe everything to the civilizations of the Near East, which we had taken for granted before that, but there was a lot of indigenous innovation going on in Europe in the Stone Age. And one of the things he particularly referred to was Tom's work in identifying a prehistoric calendar, for example, from all these astronomical alignments. And that book appeared in 1973, and I wrote one, Science and Society in Prehistoric Britain, in 1977, which followed up that idea and tried to explain how well-known archaeological sites could in fact have been the training colleges and residences of the kind of priesthood that Colin Renfrew was proposing. After that, there was a bit of a reaction against it, and the reaction gathered pace in the 80s after Clive Ruggles began his programme of research, the aim of which seems to have been to show that Tom's ideas were exaggerated, and particularly the notion that there were accurate alignments, Ruggles thought he had disproved quite decisively. And I think the archaeological profession was really rather pleased that this had come about, because it then didn't have to undergo this fundamental rethink about Neolithic society. As to why there is this conservatism in archaeology, well, partly it's because of a natural reticence about accepting a dramatic new theory suddenly. You know, people want to test it and assess it over many years. But I think also another major part of the problem is that the evidence which Tom used is extremely difficult for a layman to understand in detail. You know, you have to be familiar with elements of astronomy, simple mathematics and so on. And the fact is that these things are not taught in archaeology courses in Britain. So it's quite difficult for colleagues to be familiar with the evidence and what it means. Well, whatever the result, I'm afraid the current situation is that Tom is not talked about, and people like myself who occasionally raise the subject are regarded as on the fringe and a bit balmy, to be honest. The amount of surveying and skilled surveying and measuring that these Neolithic peoples did, again, is a controversial subject. My own views on all this have to be controlled by what I've actually done myself as a researcher in fieldwork and so on. And I personally think it's very important that, particularly when you're following an unorthodox line, you have to try and justify it by the experimental method, by making a prediction from the new evidence and seeing if it can be tested by fieldwork. So the amount of successful testing I've been able to do is confined to specific astronomical alignments and geometry and measuring to some extent. I have not personally done anything concerning possible miles-long surveying, though I know people have argued, even Tom argued himself, that there was some evidence for the placing of stone circles, for example, at units of megalithic yards, but I've never done anything to check that myself, so I wouldn't really want to comment on that. But in theory, I suppose it is perfectly reasonable, considering that these structures are so widely distributed over the British Isles. How you would demonstrate it as fact, I'm not quite so sure.
And what do you make of the whole idea about lays, about these straight line alignments going over vast distances that Alfred Watkins came up with in the 1920s?
Ley lines, well, that is a subject which you only have to mention it to an archaeologist and you're immediately classed as beyond the fringe, you know. So again, I haven't done any work on this myself, and from what I've heard today, for example, it does seem as though certain types of sites do form straight lines, at least judging by the names of the sites. To archaeologists, though, ley lines have a bit of a reputation of including too many sites of different ages to be plausible. I think it's one of these things you would have to do a really rigorous investigation, choose only sites of a certain type, like standing stones or stone circles, which could be said to be more or less contemporary, and then survey them accurately and see if there was any trace of this. I'm not sure that's really been done yet, so I'd reserve judgment on that. The date of these sites is a very important problem, of course, a very important subject. There is an argument that some sites are much older than we have thought. All I can say to that is that there is now a whole string of radiocarbon dates for Stonehenge, for example, which have been slotted into the various phases of the development of the site. They were all described in an article in Antiquity by Mike Parker Pearson a couple of years ago, and there's certainly no suggestion from those dates as a whole that the site is older than about 3000 BC. And as far as I know, neighbouring sites of Neolithic type, like Durrington Walls, Woodhenge, and so on, their available radiocarbon dates firmly slot them into the Neolithic period too. Now there are older sites, of course. We normally describe them as of the Mesolithic age, the hunter-gatherer period. I can't recall myself anything that's shocked the archaeological profession and made them rethink all this, but I may be wrong about that. But I think what you have to remember is it's not just a single date, but a whole suite of dates for individual sites that really are needed to tell us how old they are, and so far I don't think there's been any major hiccup in the standardised radiocarbon chronology for the Neolithic period. My own work in this field has tried to focus on making predictions from Professor Thom's theories and trying to test them by archaeological fieldwork. So I'd quite like to mention one example, which is a standing stone at Kintraw in Argyllshire. This first came to my attention when Thom's second book was published, I think in the early 70s. It was called Megalithic Lunar Observatories, and he described a standing stone at Kintraw in that, pointing out that there was a magnificent long alignment to the southwest from the stone, which took your eye to a couple of conspicuous mountains on the island of Jura, and the midwinter sunset went down just in the notch between these two peaks, something like 28 miles away. So it's a long alignment, and sufficiently long that the midwinter's day, the shortest day of the year, would be known exactly. The problem was that when you stand beside the stone at Kintraw, you can't actually see the notch on Jura because of an intervening ridge, tree-covered ridge. So there was a bit of a problem there, and Thom recognised it. Either he had to make some special pleading that they had a site a little higher up where they could see over the obstruction, or of course this was a devastating disproof of his long alignment theory. And he found on a hillside about 200 yards northeast of the stone a couple of boulders which he thought would be the place where they stood, and actually could get a clear view of Jura and the midwinter sunset. So when I read all this, I thought, well, if that's the case, then maybe there's an artificial platform there for the observers, and I will go and excavate it and find out whether there is or not. So it was the first time I had a chance to test this theory with a practical prediction and go and dig. And we found the platform. Unfortunately, it didn't have any artifacts or any charcoal for C14 dating, but a soil scientist came from the University of Aberdeen and did some intricate tests and established, I think beyond doubt, that the rubble platform at Kintraw, which is revetted by two massive boulders to keep it in place, was in fact artificial. And there's also another little standing stone a bit higher up the slope, which reinforces the idea that the three items are connected. The little standing stone higher on the slope, the platform and notch, boulder notch on the hill slope, and the standing stone in the field below. They're all lined up on Jura and on the midwinter sunset. So I think this is a fairly decisive confirmation of Tom's basic ideas, and I think it was the result of this that really made me persist in looking for more evidence for or against his ideas, and on the whole they have been for, but I'm sure colleagues might say, well, I've been a bit biased about that, but of course I don't agree. But it still remains controversial, I'm afraid, and I haven't got to the point yet of being able to say I've convinced my colleagues that there's something in all this. It's not too late though. I hope to do so still. I think that archaeology courses in Britain ought at least to include an element of surveying, the surveying skills which are required to assess standing stone and stone circle alignments and the plans of stone circles. So at least people, the new generation of archaeologists, would be aware of the kind of information that can be collected from them and assess it. At the moment there is, as far as I know, no such course except in Clive Ruggles' own old department in Leicester, where students have been taught for a number of years how to do this. I think on the whole though that this kind of evidence is so controversial that we're not going to make any progress in the profession of archaeology unless Clive Ruggles' ideas of very rough alignments are accepted, or unless entirely independent archaeological evidence comes up that there was a priesthood in existence in that time. And I think we may be coming to the point when the latter condition is becoming real. There are some remarkable discoveries, particularly in the island of Orkney, which are beginning to suggest that there's no doubt at all there were temples there and a priesthood, exactly as Tom's evidence would have predicted.